In this segment, I'm going to talk about properties in SceneDesigner and how you use them. So here we have the MATLAB scene. I'm going to select the mobile that's entity in the middle here, and its properties show up over here in the Entity Properties panel. Now you'll notice in here that the properties are categorized by component. So we have in this particular entity a scene graph component, which contains a NIF file path, and a transformation component, which contains its translation in space. If we select the spotlight over here, we have different components. Over here we have a light component, which contains a bunch of properties that include the color of the light, the type of the light, and so on. And we contain a shadow generator component, which indicates that this light casts shadows, and the different shadow technique that it uses, as well as size hints for the shadow maps and other parameters. So properties in general can be inherited from, they're defined by a template. So if we select this item here, and we go over here and say show template, we'll notice this is the prop mobile template. And if we look at this template, we see here are the properties which are defined by the components in that template, if you remember from the components segment. And this specifies a particular NIF file path for this object. Now this NIF file path property is actually inherited. So if we come down here, we'll see that this particular NIF file path property on the entity itself is not bold. That means that it is inherited from the master. We can, so if I were to change the property up here to something else, so let's change it to something completely different, then what we would end up with is a different file that's loaded, and you'll notice that this has changed to inherit from that. Now we can right click on any property that is inherited and tell it to make it unique. This means that even if we come up here and we change this back to what we want, which was the mobile, it will not affect the value of this property in the entity that inherits from that template. Now we can go in and change it here as well to be something else entirely. There we have a pillar that is rotating. So that's fine. And if we ever want to go back to inheriting from the master, we simply right click on the property and say reset, and we go back to inherit that property from the template. So that's the basics of inheriting properties. Some properties, such as these transformation properties, are not inherited. For transformation component and translation, rotation, and scale, it doesn't make a lot of sense to inherit that from a template because each instance will have its own values. And so these values, notice, show up as bold because they are unique, but you cannot reset them. There are a few other things in the Entity Properties panel that are of note. One is whether or not the entity is hidden or frozen. These can be changed here, but that will cause the entity to be unselected, and you need to unhide them via the selection panel. The name is also listed here, and if we wanted to change the name, we could do so by simply typing in here and pressing enter. So now, if we look in the selection panel, it's now named My Prop Mobile 01 instead of Prop Mobile 01. I think that is it for properties. Oh no, actually I remembered. So this is a different, each property can have a different type. And this is a string. It's just a file path, but it's also a file path. It's a NIF file path, in fact. And that tells SceneDesigner to allow you to click this little ellipsis button and pop up a file choosing dialog. So each property can have a different editor, such as this. So for example, if we come in here for this light, we want to change the color of this light, we can click in here, click down, and select a different color for the light. Same thing for the light type. If we don't want this to be a spotlight, we want it to be a point light, we can click down there and it changes to a point light. So each property has its own data type as well as its own way of editing the property. There's also property collections. This is an example of a collection. So it says affected entities expand to see 4 subproperties. So if we open that up, we can see in here that we have the 4 different affected entities. And this particular property does not allow you to edit the entities in this expansion. Instead, we have to click this little ellipsis button to bring up a different dialog that allows us to add and remove items in the collection. Another example of an expanded property is translation. And in this case, we can actually see the subcomponents X, Y, and Z, and can actually go in there and change them if we want. Notice the light has now moved. So that's it for the property basics and how properties work in SceneDesigner.